Ohana Chapter 4. They knew something was wrong when Sonic didn't sit downstairs for breakfast that morning. Maddie and Tom were still getting used to being parents, and being parents to superpowered alien children was something different from normal. They had babysat JoJo a couple of times before Rachel had moved to San Francisco, but the sense that something was not right had never been prevalent before now. Maddie set her cup of coffee down on the table and called both upstairs and downstairs again, listening for a response before sharing a look with her husband. Tom got out of his chair and started heading upstairs while Maddie took the downstairs into Knuckles' den. Pushing the drapes back from the doorway, she stepped over where she knew a trap was, letting the curtain fall behind her as she entered the basement of her house.
Knuckles.
The lump on the mattress and pile of blankets stared, puffed, and turning over to peer up at her with one hazy purple eye, dreadlocks unkempt. Maddie stood a distance away from the nest even if she wanted to push that one draping over his head out of his face.
Knuckles, sweetie, it's time for breakfast.
I'm not hungry.
Knuckles sounded tired, and Maddie made a gesture asking if she could come closer, to which he placed his head back down into his nest as though to burrow further into the blankets. That was a real concern. Knuckles was usually a stickler for personal space, getting prickly when someone was too close. Maddie crept forward and knelt next to his bed, reaching out to press the back of her hand against his forehead. Knuckles recoiled at the touch, hissing softly with a half-hearted snarl making its way to curl across his muzzle as she took his temperature.
You're sick, buddy.
I'm not sick.
The sneeze that immediately left him said otherwise, his shoulders shivering as he sat up in protest, looking at her grumpily.
I have duties. I can't get sick.
Maddie's brow knit together as she let her hand drop, fingers lingering on his cheek. Knit.
Sweetie, you're on Earth.
That seemed to make him pause, eyes glassy and staring past her before he lowered his chin a little. Maddie swore if he had visible ears like tails they'd be drooping. She wondered what she should do. Being a veterinarian, her first concern was what kind of virus had affected him, and her second was how to treat it. But he was alien. Did she treat him as human or animal? A crash sound coming from upstairs made Knuckles jump, his claws digging into the mattress and tail flicking in alarm. Maddie pressed a finger to his nose and promised to be back before she traipsed back upstairs, once again avoiding the trap at the entrance. Ozzy whined at her when she approached the top step, pivoting on the landing in time for Tom to come down the stairs with Tails in his arms, wrapped with a blanket and twin tails draped over Tom's arms. Her attention was drawn on the blue figure in the Sonic-shaped hole in the wall, a thumbs up coming up over his head as he sounded even worse than Knuckles.
Told you I could handle stairs.
Their sound slurred, Maddie sharing a look with her husband.
Let's ask him if he could handle walking downstairs by himself. I didn't expect him to go crazy into the wall.
He's a superpowered alien hedgehog. What did you expect?
Maddie raised an eyebrow, Tom, as she let Sonic pick himself up out of the hole, reaching over to brush the hair away from their youngest's face. Tails' ears droop, the motion making him stir in Tom's grasp as he looked at her blearily.
Mom!
The word made her smile as she motioned for Tom to bring him over to the kitchen bench, sitting him upright, and Sonic hopped onto one of the chairs before joining him on the counter. Tails looked smaller than usual, draped in his blanket covered in stars and planets. His eyes washed out as he let Sonic keep him propped up even as the hedgehog coughed and sneezed all over the place.
Hold still for me, sweetie. Could you get me my medical kit?
Tom disappeared from her side to fetch the medkit from where she kept it stashed in case Ozzy had something wrong with him, and Maddie took hold of Tails' head in both of her hands, tilting it so that she could examine him. His nose was wet, forehead warm like Knuckles had been, her thumbs lifting his upper lip to see his teeth as though she was examining any animal at the clinic. He moved his mouth when she let it drop, wetting his lips, and she tilted his head to peer into his ears.
Sonic, you've been on Earth for 10 years, right?
Tom placed her medkit on the kitchen bench as Sonic nodded, running his gloved finger underneath his nose as he sniffed. Tapping the otoscope, Maddie pulled the flaps at the side of Tails' ears gently to the side, looking out the corner of her eye at the hedgehog.
Have you been sick before?
No, maybe once.
His brow furrowed as he looked pensive, scratching his head.
It was about a year or two after I got here. The bad winter. I had to sneak into a house while the owners were away for the season so I could keep warm, but I don't remember a lot.
The parish's kid was at the baseball game. Even though he was sick, maybe Sonic caught it from him.
Tom suggested, placing a hand into the small of the boy's back as he sneezed again, trying to keep him from slamming himself into another wall. Their insurance was already having a fit over Robotnik's last attempt.
Sonic's immune system would be used to Earthviruses by now.
Maddie hummed, now looking at Tails' eyes with a mini torch as the fox squirmed.
It's why he's not as out of it as Muzz and Knuckles are. His symptoms are milder than theirs.
She turned away from her sons, fiddling around in her kit before finding what she was looking for.
Before we can get them well enough to see the doctor, this is the best I'm going to have to do.
She set the bottle down on the bench and tapped the needle to make sure it was lined up properly, shifting back so that she was in front of the alien kids in her care. Sonic's ears flicked forward in alarm before flattening back against his head, and he made to escape before Tom caught him by the scruff of the neck. He swung out, hitting her husband in the arm but without the usual force behind it.
It's just so that you can build up a better immune system,
she said gently, resting a caring hand on Tails' head when he flinched at the sight of the needle.
Human viruses can't be good for Mobians. You want to be a good big brother, right?
The hedgehog paused in his fighting, looking at Tails, who was shivering and wringing his hands under the blankets. Tails flicking this way and that. He looked about to bolt, his upper lip curling, and he looked half ready to bite Maddie's hand off. This was a stark reminder that her kids might be alien, but they were also animal. Sonic seemed to limp in Tom's hand as he scooted closer to Tails, placing a hand on his shoulder.
It's okay, little buddy. Mom knows what she's doing.
He sent her a look asking if she did, and Maddie nodded, watching Tails reach for Sonic's hand as Tom let go of the scruff of his neck, paws squeezing together and the fox burying his face in Sonic's shoulder with a whine.
Mom will make everything better.
She hummed as she readied Tails' arm, then gave him the injection. Maddie felt him stiffen, his tails flicking and ears pulling back, but it was all over in a second, and she put the needle and bottle in a safe box and withdrew a piece of cotton and a non-stick Band-Aid on his spot, caressing her thumb over it.
There's my big brave boy.
She cooed, smooching the kid's nose in a way that made him giggle sleepily and squirm. She pulled back, placing her hand on her hip, and looking at Sonic.
What about you, mister? You ready for your first shot?
Sonic flinched as Tom picked Tails up when the youngster turned around and motioned for him to pick him up, slumping against his chest and snuggling into his shoulder. The hedgehog puffed his chest out before the wind blew out of his sails and he held his arm out.
Jab me.
Maddie gave him a smile and prepared his needle, taking hold of his arm gently and doing the same that she had done to Tails. Sonic's ears pulled back and his fur danced with erratic lightning that didn't strike her intently, but it was over as quickly as Tails had been. She gave him a cooler Band-Aid, sucker balls, and kissed his nose, which made him squirm and poke his tongue out in disgust, falling back against the bench dramatically.
All right, you boys are now vaccinated.
Sonic and Tails both unenthusiastically gave a pump fist roll of their untouched arm.
Now you can either go to bed or take a blanket to the couch and watch a movie. No world sabbing today, kids. You need rest.
Something that's not speed.
Tom added as he pulled away from the kitchen bench, cradling Tails to him as the fox nozzled his collarbone. Sonic whined in response.
Come on, we will find something on one of the services.
He glanced at his wife.
What about Knuckles?
Maddie paused in placing the needle and bottle in the box, looking at her boys.
I don't think he'd appreciate the audience.
She finally commented, gathering her medkit in her hands and helping Sonic hop down from the kitchen counter.
I'll bring him up after.
Tom nodded and steered the kids in the direction of the den, Sonic babbling about what movie they should watch and acting out the parts to make Tails smile and giggle in his sickness. Maddie let herself smile before she headed down the stairs, once again into Knuckles' den. She was glad that they had set aside some room for the echidna, for someone who claimed to not need anything and that he was an adult. Knuckles used it more than staying in the wild, especially now that he had somewhere to store the Master Emerald. She parted the drapes and stepped around the trap again, pausing at what she saw. Ozzy was curled around Knuckles, his nose pressing coolly into the echidna's neck and acting like an extra pillow for him. She had seen him do the same with Tails before, but for Knuckles to have let his guard down enough for him to allow her dog to wrap himself around him protectively, Maddie pressed a hand to her mouth to hide her smile as Ozzy looked up at her, lifting his head to pant and lick his chops. She approached the next, patting his head and giving him a rub behind the ear before she sat down on the mattress next to them and brushed her hand along one of Knuckles' dreads. He looked much smaller like this, more like a boy than a teenager, his dark fingers twitching in Ozzy's fur at her touch as he mumbled in his sleep.
Father, no, Father, please.
Maddie's hand stilled at the noises coming from him, her frown deepening. She had only heard him mention a father once or twice, but his comments always stilled before he could divulge any further information. Knuckles whined under his breath, burying his face in Ozzy's shoulder.
Don't be.
If she ever met Knuckles' father, he was going to have to catch her hands. Knuckles stiffened as he realized that he wasn't alone, visible eyes shooting open to look at her wildly as Maddie withdrew her hand. Inhaling sharply, realizing who it was, he huffed, his eyelids drooping as he turned his face into Ozzy's fur.
I bet I look pretty pathetic, huh?
On the contrary.
She said, placing her hand back in her lap and tilting her head to catch his sight.
Everyone gets sick, Knuckles.
Not me, Guardians don't get sick. We can't get sick.
It was like something that had been drilled into him from a young age. She imagined an older echidna with a beard telling him such. Even with his son looking at him and obviously ill, she reached to take his paw, careful of his claws, and smoothed her thumb over his knuckles.
Well, I have something that can help ease it if you let me. It's not a cure-all, but it won't be as bad if you get sick again.
He turned a little, Ozzy patient as he rested his head against the dog's stomach and sighed, looking at her with a firm look that was faltering in his desperation to not feel as yuck as he was feeling.
How do I take it?
She explained the process, what it was, how it could help, and she let Knuckles think it over, sniffling and still so warm under his fur.
Okay.
She gave him a smile and picked her medkit up from where she had set it down next to his mattress, putting things together like she had for Sonic and Tails. Knuckles struggled to sit himself up to watch her curiously, Ozzy rolling so that he was pressed against the echidna's back comfortingly as Maddie gestured for his arm. Knuckles inhaling to steel himself as the needle went in, his brow furrowed, huffing as she withdrew it, placing a cotton ball and a band-aid on the spot.
I used to be able to make remedies.
Oh, really?
Maddie deposited the needle and bottle into the same box as the others, closing it tight and putting it into her kit to be disposed of as he looked at his arm.
And the wasteland has flora unlike anything I've seen on this planet.
He said, dropping his hands into his lap.
I don't think I could make the same things with as much potency.
We could trade.
She suggested, cupping her hand over his and making him look at her.
When you're better?
Knuckles smiled softly and returned to his previous position, curled up against Ozzy, the golden retriever now firmly resting on his bed for the day it seemed. Maddie smoothed her hand over his dreads again, standing to leave before she heard him murmur something half awake.
Thanks, Mother.